Well, hello everyone. Welcome to the audio lecture on the Proto-Renaissance. What we mean by that is the time just before the great revolution in art that was the Renaissance. In order to understand the magnitude of these changes in art, it can be useful to look at what came just before. Now, the Renaissance started pretty much right at the year 1400. Prior to 1400, from the death of Christ till about the year 1200, art moved very far away from the influence of the Greeks into a kind of an abstracted style. Artists were anonymous generally, and mostly created their art for religious or spiritual reasons. So, as I said, most of the art that was created in this period was created in service of spiritual or religious inspiration. So what we have as a result is incredibly beautiful altarpieces that were created for churches throughout Italy. And that was something that really struck me when I was in Italy a few years ago, was you can almost feel the reverence of the artists that created these works. And honestly, when I went to Italy, I was a little skeptical about medieval art. But after I sat in those places and looked at the real grandeur of works that were created with such limited means, I changed my point of view. So let's look down below on the right where it says diptych and triptych and polyptych. Well, the main ones that I want you to remember, and they're super simple to remember, is a duo is a two. Usually that means two, so that's a diptych, and that's a two-paneled altar piece. Mostly what we see is the triptych, 3 panels, because in that you have a main panel in the center and 2 on each side, 1 on each side. So write down triptych, because you will probably see that word again, and it will make you sound smart when you're looking at art. Okay, so before we look at the evolution, let's look at what came before. And this is an example of the late medieval Christian art. This is the Byzantine style. And what you see here is that the figures are really elongated and their heads are kind of teeny. Let's consider that the realistic human form is basically 7.5 heads tall. Well, this one, I haven't counted it, but it's about 10 heads tall. And one thing that can be useful when you're looking at this art is that my feeling is that they weren't trying to be realistic, that there was more importance placed on the symbolic nature of what they were creating. Here's another one, though. I wanted to show you guys this one because look at the little baby. It's an old man baby. Now, that is something that we see a lot of in the Middle Ages and really carrying over into the Renaissance as well. There is a video about that in this week's chapter. I used to think that the only reason that they painted old man babies was because the artists lacked the skill to understand how to make a baby look like a baby. But then I learned that there's this ideal that the Christ child came upon earth and was already so developed that it would be disrespectful to paint him as a baby. Now, you might think, why does this baby look like an old man? This is so simple. When you look at a baby, when they're born, their eyes are way down in their head, like 3/4 or more of the head is above the eyes. And as the child grows, the eyes go up in the head. And an adult has their eyes halfway between the top of the head and the chin. Now, if you haven't taken art and you don't believe me, then just go measure. Let's pop over and look at the key terms. Tempera paint, also called egg tempera, is actually pigment, which would be powdered, oftentimes precious gems like lapis lazuli, for the blue or carnelian for the red. It would be powdered up in a mortar and pestle and then mixed into egg yolk with a little bit of water. I had a good friend who was a master of this media, and I should say medium. I had a good friend who was a master of this medium, and as soon as the pigment hits the surface, it dries. So it's really kind of like drawing because you can't mix it on the canvas. So now we'll talk about gilding. Very thin gold leaf applied with glue to a surface. And what they would use the gilding for, the gold leaf, was to emphasize the spiritual light around the form. This is the artist Cimabue, and he was a contemporary of an artist that is really credited with starting the Renaissance in a way. He is called the forefather of the Renaissance, and that artist would be Giotto. So we'll look at this briefly, take it in, and now let's look at another artist, Duccio. Let's go back. Notice the angels. Notice the way they're all stacked up, one angel on top of the other. Now that's going to begin to move just a little bit when we get to Duccio. See how they're all spread out, and there's a lot more life in the form. Now, if you compare this to work of today, maybe it still looks pretty stiff. One thing I will say is that being in the presence of these works is so powerful because of the gold leaf, because of the size, because of the real concentration that the artists used to create the pieces. One of the things you might notice is that the Madonna has a real big head, and it's an old man baby, and all the other surrounding worshipers and angels, well, they have little bitty heads. So we're on our way. There's a lot of symbolism here, but we're not quite into the realism yet. And now we have Giotto. So this is considered to be the revolutionary piece. Okay, so it's still an old man baby, but if you look closely at Mary, see, she has a look about her. Look at the folds of her garment. Look at the way that she's holding the child is not nearly so stiff. And look at the angels on either side. They have some movement to them. This angel is kind of turning a little bit. Again, this is not a big deal if you compare it to the art that came after, but for its time, it was totally revolutionary. Here we have a classic comparison. In fact, if you go to the Uffizi Gallery, which is the main museum in Florence, these two are displayed right next to each other. And this is done so that we can study this evolution in style. And look at the difference. They were painted 20 years apart. Consider that the one on the right is painted in a way that had never been done before. Here's another very famous one by Giotto. Now, Giotto is an interesting character. Shortly before he was doing what he did, the monk, St. Francis, began to preach of a different way of approaching the Catholic faith, of approaching spirituality. And St. Francis preached that the natural world was really the place where we could find our spiritual connection. And he also believed in living very simply. This was very different than the church at the time, the Catholic Church, which really believed in opulence. And there was a belief there that God loved splendor. And so the bishops and the higher priests could live in splendor because that was how they would, honor God. St. Francis came along and he said, no way, that's not really how that he believed that we should live. So Giotto was a follower of St. Francis. He was what we call a lay monk. So he was able to marry and have a family, but at the same time, he lived his life dedicated to the principles of St. Francis. While a person might look at this and think, oh, it still looks a little stiff, check out what the angels are doing. If you look closely, they're all over the place. They're nothing like the stiff angels that we saw only shortly before. Here's some terms for you. Fresco, that means the application of wet plaster and pigment. So if you've ever done sheetrock or seen somebody do sheetrock, imagine that you had thinned down sheetrock paste with color in it. That is how this was done. They would only do a small area each day, maybe 2 feet by 3 feet. This is how Michelangelo did the Sistine Chapel. It's an architectural style of painting. And then we have a great term, chiaroscuro. This is a term you will need to remember. It will come up in the next couple of lessons. And it means a contrast of light and dark. So if you look here, there's not quite as strong of a contrast as we'll see later in the works of artists like Leonardo da Vinci, or most particularly the artist Rembrandt that came a little bit after. The next term that I'd like you to remember is foreshortening, the use of perspective to show the extension of an object back into space. If you study these angels that are twirling around like butterflies up in the air, there's a lot of foreshortening there. And this is really the first time that we've seen this in art. In painting, it's the first time we've seen it. The Greeks might have done that, but none of their paintings survived. Okay, so now as we complete our foray into the world of the Proto-Renaissance, let's look at just a few more. This is by Martini and Memmi, and I've seen this one. It's really big. The center panel is over 10 feet tall. And being in the presence of this work, again, I'll return to the idea, it's just so powerful. And let's look at that. The artist probably didn't have the intention of creating a strong, realistic scene. Instead, they were more interested in symbolism. One more piece that we'll look at is a detail from a very large multi-paneled fresco by the artist Lorenzetti. And the fresco, the big work, is called The Effects of Good Government in the City and in the Country. I'm bringing this up because the problem of governance has been something that humanity and artists have been looking at for almost 1,000 years in looking at this piece dated 1300. If you look closely at this piece, I find it really beautiful in its abstracted forms. So this is justice in the middle, surrounded by all the things that are supporting justice. And then we have the devil and the bad government and everything that supports bad government. Now, it's up to the individual to determine which is what in our current era. But again, look at these problems. People have been trying to work this out for a long time. So, as they say, history repeats itself. And to close our final slide, here we have a comparison of Cimabue with a Madonna of Raphael. These were painted roughly 150 years apart. By the time we get to the Raphael painting, this way of painting had become standard. And consider that prior to the year 1400, it had never been done. So now we have the foundations for what will become the Renaissance. Thank you for listening. More to come.